August 9th, 1988. Cass, why don't you just give me some background about how you got interested in the industry, your early dealings with the industry. Why did you get into it?
Okay, that's a good question for me. I started out to be a Lutheran minister, and about the time of World War II, and I did anything not to become a minister, because back in those days it was popular to go to the Army. So I went to the Army, went through World War II, and after World War II I did elect not to go back to college and to take some trade school training, which I did, and I joined up with a company called General Heating and Cooling Company of Kansas City, a distributor then of General Electric equipment, and more recently, in the last since 1960, they were a Carrier air conditioning company. And my life proceeded to a Carrier, normally field engineer. You take a course of training in Syracuse, New York, back in those days, and you get assigned to a territory. Of course, mine was automatically built in to be the Kansas City area, which turned out to be all of the state of Kansas and 2/3 of Missouri. And I was a field engineer, which was a good name for a refrigeration mechanic. And the more schooling you got, eventually everybody dropped the name mechanic and you became an engineer. I was one of the few people in this part of the country that pioneered the heating system, basically for houses, known as perimeter heating system. And I wrote numerous papers on that subject, and they were published by various trade magazines, and I believe it was through one of those magazine articles that I met a fellow out of K-State known as Dr. Ralph Nevins.
Before you continue, about what time was that you worked on the perimeter system?
That was 1959, and it was with another fellow. You want names?
Sure.
Okay, his name was Chuck Tolier.
How's that spelled?
Chuck is easy. Tolier is capital T-O-L-E-A-H-R. He was from Holland. He was a Dutchman. And did the system for, in those days, it was General Electric. It was known as the air wall system, which was carried out to the industry, and then the air wall name dropped and just called perimeter heating system. My job was to put one of those systems into every county in Kansas. There are a lot of counties in Kansas. Well, at the end of 2 years, we were solid in Kansas with perimeter heating. And part of that success came from Ralph Nevins out at K-State, who was interested also in promoting perimeter heating, because he felt that putting heat on the outside wall of the structure was the place for it. And the only difference is that I did it in the real houses and he did it in the laboratory. And about this time, the ASHRAE Environmental Test Chamber was being relocated from Cleveland, Ohio, into Manhattan, Kansas, on the campus of the Kansas State University. It was about 1962, 63, along in that period.
Okay, and what did, how did you get involved with the environmental laboratory? What did you really have to do with it?
Well, that was another good thing. When all the equipment arrived, the sticks and stones and nuts and bolts arrived, they had a Carrier compressor, can you believe, on the system that made chilled water, and the compressor was not performing well. So one day Ralph said, "Cass, do you know anything about compressors?" I said, "A little." Well, of course, I was an ex-mechanic, trained by the good old General Electric Company at 5 Lawrence Street, Bloomfield, New Jersey. I knew a lot about compressors. I knew a lot less about Carrier's compressor, but I knew that we had them because we were the distributor in Kansas City for all of Kansas and 2/3 of Missouri. So I said yes, and I said, "Give me about a week and I'll find you one." Well, I came back to Kansas City and looked around, and I found one on the shelf that was discarded, charged off, and no funds. So I put it in my car, delivered it out to the lab, and the ASHRAE got its first free Carrier compressor. and as far as I know, it's still running. But I met Ralph through this, and then also Ralph was a ham radio operator. I am a ham radio operator. And Ralph was a pilot. I am a pilot of a single-engine aircraft. So I would call Ralph on the radio and say, I'm coming out. How about it? He says, great, I'll pick you up. And either he would come to the airport in Manhattan and pick me up, or he would send somebody out. And one thing led to another, and he dabbled around in photography. I dabbled around in photography. So it was kind of a labor of love for both of us. In fact, Ralph had the open door policy in Manhattan. Anytime you wanted to go see the dean of the College of Engineering, could go over there, open the door, walk in, and you were welcome. And it was a easy place to find around. More often than not, I would drop in about lunch, hoping to take Ralph to lunch, and almost in every case, Ralph would have an invitation to speak somewhere. He'd say, I'll tell you what, you go with me. And that's what we did. We'd go with Ralph to all over the places. He would make numerous noon lunches, and he would always take a guest along. People in Manhattan almost got to know you. I got to be very popular and very well known out in Manhattan, Kansas, for a number of reasons, mostly due to Dr. Ralph Nevins, who also had a ham radio station on the university campus. And it operates under call letters W0QQQ and still does today. And that was nice. We taped Ralph to bring his thoughts to the local chapter of Kansas City, ASHRAE, and we would create a thing that we call today the Kansas City Sparkler. It was an interview in Manhattan, because Manhattan is about 2 hours away. To Kansas City, they did not make every ASHRAE meeting, which was then ASV. And the tape recordings brought a message from Manhattan, from the dean of the College of Engineering, a little prestigious for the group, and that lended to better attendance at Kansas City. So Ralph was always a part of the Kansas City meeting, in person or impromptu. Sometimes he would be at a meeting already in Kansas City, and he would come out to our monthly meetings and do guest appearances. And he always told us what the projects were that he was doing. And this was always interesting, because a lot of the projects back in those days was financed and funded by ASHRAE in part. In fact, my education came a lot from the interviews of Ralph Nevins and others visiting at K-State. It got so that I was out at K-State almost once a week and almost an afternoon a week. And this went on for years and years and years, until Ralph left. And of course, he died. And then, because we got to know a new incoming professor, Dr. Fred Rolas, we had the same type of rapport with Fred. Fred was in a different world, the world of psychology, and eventually, he became a member of ASHRAE, and eventually he replaced Dr. Nevins entirely, and was in charge of the environmental laboratory out there. Now, this time period would be, I really don't know, 1967, 68, 69, along in there. No, it had to be about 1970. It was 1970. And I know that because we made a tape at that time. Remember, we didn't have VHS television then. We had slides and good old audio 7-inch reels. And that's what we did. The biggest project that Ralph and his group at K-State did for me was to prove that the location of the return air grill was not important to a complete comfort system. We did this by film and by smoke test, and I think one of his boys wrote a research paper for him which showed that any return air any place was acceptable. It turns out, of course, that return air was inexpensive in the central part of a room and more costly on the outside air, on the outside wall of a room. So this was nice. But that was the #1 project. Whenever somebody would say your air circuit is all wrong, I'd say, well, according to K-State's ASHRAE-funded research checkout, it appears that return air can come from anywhere. You control the temperature and the comfort by putting air on the outside wall under pressure. And to this day, I think that's the way it stands.
Okay, since you knew Ralph Nevins as well as you did, what can you tell us about him on a personal basis? Maybe some interesting things about him. What kind of a person was he?
Well, unlike Ralph, I like beer. I was raised in a German community, and beer was the cocktail period. Ralph did not drink beer. In fact, Ralph did not drink anything. Ralph was a good Methodist teetotaler, and everywhere we would go, he would kid me about my drinking beer, but he didn't object to my drinking beer. He just wouldn't drink beer. So he was a nice guy. He would drink 7-Up at a party or meeting. At lunch, of course, it'd be iced tea. He didn't particularly drink coffee, but Ralph was one of the nicest, friendliest engineers that you could ever hope to meet. Very knowledgeable, and he had a memory that would expound on any subject just on the wave of your hand. And he would never embarrass a person for not knowing something. He would moreover restate what he thought you were saying and ask you if that was correct. He was a great dean of the College of Engineering, but what I remember Ralph most for was the open door policy. Anybody, any student, any friend, particularly a friend of the university, was always invited to visit there. And when he said visit, he meant he personally would invite you in and talk to you and visit with you. And he was a very busy man visiting, which of course related to research money and funds. And much of ASHRAE's funding, I'm sure, happened because of ASHRAE's knowing Dr. Ralph Nevins. You always called Ralph Ralph. He actually used the word doctor when he was out professionally doing a speech or a program. Otherwise, it was Ralph. And on the air, the ham radio operators, it was Ralph. It was Pilot Ralph. And the story related to that is one time we were out there, he bumped his head, and he said he should have had a hard hat. Well, the great rapport we had with the K-State people, and particularly Ralph Nevins, one of the meetings, we knew he was coming to Kansas City because he was our guest speaker. We called it Hard Hat Night. And on that particular night, we gave Ralph the local 533 and the mechanical contractors of Kansas, greater Kansas City, gave Ralph a hard hat and had his name engraved on it. And that's where he got his hard hat from. That was one of our stories.
Anything else that you remember about him that would be interesting to relate?
Yeah, because I went to another church, I can't tell you about his church activity, but we were told, and everybody kidded him about his singing. He was a good singer, and he did sing a lot with church groups, and around the university he was known for his music.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about your amateur radio group. I understand that you and a bunch of other ASHRAE members have formed a radio group.
Yes, we call ourselves ASHRAE Hams. ASHRAE Hams. Started out a couple of months ago accidentally by Larry Staples, who was about that time just hanging up his hat from being regional director of Region 9. And Larry found out that when he traveled, a lot of people he talked with were hams. So he says, hey, we ought to get on the air and talk to each other. Well, started out with perhaps 3 or 4 people. And as time went along, we grew. And today, the count of ASHRAE hams nationwide exceeds 30 licensed ham stations located from the East Coast to the West Coast, from New Orleans and the Gulf up to Canada. And we meet twice a month on the air, and we talk about our jobs, we talk about ASHRAE, we talk about ham radio fellowship, and we keep the fires burning of information about ASHRAE material. Larry is the net control, and we operate on 2 frequencies. We operate on the high bands, which is 20 meters, and we operate on the lower bands on 40 meters. And that's in the event that one Sunday maybe the solar sunspots are not favorable to the radio transmission, so we use the other frequency. Right now we're using both on the same day, and it's got to be a good spirit. We have learned to know new people in ASHRAE, and we found out that some of us had things in common, such as a station in Erie, Pennsylvania, that I talked with Lloyd Stabler. Lloyd had a refrigeration background, and my background was refrigeration. So we talked about what we did, and I was pioneering the perimeter air wall system later with air conditioning, and Lloyd wrote a number of the research papers on capillary tubes that was tied into the refrigerating system that we were using. We found that, in fact, that one of the companies he associated with in those days was Kelvinator, and after the war, and briefly, I was a Kelvinator dealer in Boonville, Missouri, which was attempting to form a refrigeration society known as RSES, Refrigeration Service Engineers Society, and we worked at that. It was not totally successful, but because of it, now we talk about it with Lloyd, and now we're able to look back in those days and see what we could have done to have made it more successful. Of course, it all turned out well. Both Lloyd and myself ended up with ASHRAE, and he's more concerned with the refrigeration end, and I was more concerned with the air and the air distribution end. But we had a past. And in radio, ASHRAE radio, our paths crossed several times, but we did not know who it was. Our paths crossed with another ASHRAE ham, a Dave Dart, who used to live in Kansas City, and whose mother was the secretary to Alexander Graham Bell. Well, Dave lives in Hackettstown, New Jersey, and we talk on the radio today about the things that we used to do. Dave Dart and myself started out in Kansas City in ASHRAE doing a thing that we called the Kansas City Sparkler. It was a tape and slide visit to industry to visit something or somebody to see what something new was happening in the industry. Dave would check the technical side, and I would try to cut the tape end of it to make it sound more interesting. And together we pioneered what we call today the Kansas City Sparkler. And we settled down after Dave moved. I did it totally by myself, and we moved to we kept the same idea, but we added a little bit of humor to it. In fact, in ASHRAE, the ASHRAE Sparklers were used to promote international fellowship, particularly the year when I was the international membership chairman, first for Region 7, and then later for the whole society. And we used the sparklers also when I was a part of the education committee and research committee. The first sparkler in ASHRAE that was known was pioneered and put together with I can't remember his first name. Collins out of Oklahoma. What was Collins' first name? Frank Bridgers out of New Mexico, and Collins, and someone in Chicago. They all flew to Kansas City, and on the floor of our house we put together the first research slide and tape film for ASHRAE to raise money. And the report that Frank Bridgers gave me in a letter was, of course, the customary thank you, but it set new records for ASHRAE. And after that, slides and tape became a commonplace effort. For that little fun thing, I was given the Presidential Award of Excellence, which was given me by one of the presidents, the current president of ASHRAE, Stan Gilman, and it was suggested by Frank Bridgers, and it was presented to me by a third president. I can't remember who his name was, but it was one of the society meetings, and it was certificate number 1 of ASHRAE. And the year, I have to go to the wall and look. I should have gone to the wall. December 1971. So we're quite proud of that one.
Well, when, talking about audio-visual and ASHRAE, you had mentioned to me earlier about the fact that you think that ASHRAE is a great society and everything, but nobody knows about it, and a lot more needs to be done. Can you, talk about that for a little bit? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, after World War II, let's go back just a little bit. After World War II, I could see I got married and we were having a baby, and I could see that I had to decide in life what I was going to do. Go back to college, perhaps work on a master's, or go on up to PhD, or go right to work and make dollars for the pocketbook to raise the family. So I had to have a source of education. I decided on the latter to go to work, to take the immediate dollar to support the family to a way that we wanted to become a part of the community and buy a car and appliances. Remember, World War II was just over. Appliances were again available. So I went to work with my hands as a field engineer, and that's where I picked up the story with General Electric and Carrier. But my total education of air conditioning background came from the ASHRAE journals, the data book, and the guide. And I probably can tell you as many mistakes in the guide at that time as good things. But it was a direction to go, and to this day, I still use the ASHRAE guide and data book for all of my guidance in ASHRAE, and I'm totally 100% ASHRAE educated. And we've been very successful. I could have had any job assignment that I wanted. I chose to be the number 2 man in the company, and my calling card said the Executive Vice President of General Heating and Cooling, which is and was in those days the distributor of Carrier products. And that was a very fine assignment. Within our own company, I passed along the guide and data book, journals and things, into a thing known as the Ellsworth Cassing Training Center, which we trained our many dealers. And several hundred dealers were on continuous training, and we used the same system, and I followed the same guidelines that I had been exposed to from Ralph Nevins out at K-State, the open door policy. But the training center was named after me, and still is, as a matter of fact. But everything we did it with slides, with tape, and the open door, and the friendly handshake, and the ASHRAE guide and data book. It served well, and of course it worked. Yes, we financially successfully retired, and the lab that I have here at the house has the same policy I had at work, the open door policy. Anything goes, and we always have a friendly welcome here. The other thing I did, I would take the material out of the ASHRAE guide and data book, and I would take the theory that was explained there, and I would try to adapt it to a local practical problem. And then I would write that up in a little paper. So any of our CRCs that we went to, our chapter regions meetings, which occurred almost continually throughout the year someplace, I would give them a practical revision of what I read from theory, particularly fuel related. When energy became a problem, I became very conscious of the energy needs and the feeling. I was on the first ASHRAE committee of energy related commitments, and we did the same thing. We made sparklers, and we put it into tutorials of extracts that started with the theory of the data book, the guide, and put it into a practical booklet, which unfortunately I don't have samples. ASHRAE should have samples. We made about 25 films a year, and we wrote about these in about the same number. But at the handbooks were handed out without charge to people who attended the CRCs. So we shared again that same education, and we would give a little short meeting lecture on that subject, and then give the workbook to the people who attended the CRCs. I'm holding in my hand at this time a typical workbook, which we called, this was Region 7 primarily, with Don Nichols. Don was very instrumental when he was regional director, and he passed his work on to Robert Kilker. The one I have in my hand here says Workbook Region 7 Energy Conservation Committee, and the title was The ABCs of Energy Conservation. I always tried to take the complicated discussion of theory and convert it to the practical 1, 2, 3 how-to, the tutorial of how it worked. And that's the book I'm holding in my hand at this moment, which is typical of what we put out. Where shall we go from here?
What do you think, looking back on what you've done so far with the audio-visual material as far as ASHRAE is concerned, what do you think the future, of that type of an idea will be?
Well, presently, it continues with the thought of slides and tape. With tape cassettes, you can make an audio-visual on any subject, but it brings color to the meeting room, which stimulates attendance. They should be short presentations, no more than 4 minutes, and they should be on a single topic and as near good, colorful humor as you can come up with. But it should sell one idea, or it should do nothing more than to create fellowship and to get a train of thought to the meeting attendees. And it definitely will increase the attendance. I tried to put the number to it, and I don't know what that number would be. But we know when we showed sparklers in the Kansas City chapter that we always had about 100 people show up. Otherwise, our average attendance would be about 80. In the year that one of our presidents was there, he kept track of the attendees, and we were shooting to have 100 people at each meeting in Kansas City. Our chapter membership, I don't have recall on that, but it was a couple of hundred. But a lot of people in metropolitan chapters belong to local chapter. They live far away, like people from Manhattan, Kansas, which didn't have a chapter back in those days. Driving 2 hours to a meeting is a long way. So we had to have a lot of action at our meetings, and the sparklers brought the colorful information, thoughts. And when we showed these and we announced that we showed them, we had bigger attendance. In the year of when this president completed his year, he was pleased to announce that we had an average attendance, and his name was Bill Dyer. And I'm trying to think of the year, I can't, but we had an average attendance in Kansas City of over 110 people, and that was very good. That was the best that we had had. And the following president, the next year, asked if I would continue to make the same sparklers for the group again, and I did. I've done this for many years, and we would hold the attendance that we would gain at the first meeting, and we tried to hold it up past 100. We did not show sparklers in the Kansas City chapter in 1987 because I had many other commitments and I was involved in many other activities, and the attendance dropped to 70. And that shows that probably we should go back to having some sparklers. Sparklers are nothing more than colorful ideas shared with people that said something to be continued next month. And it stimulates people coming to a meeting. And I think we as ASHRAE should provide some material. The Education Committee could put out sparklers. The Energy Conservation membership, research. Sure, it raises money for research. And I think the research film last year was an excellent slideshow. And I'm sure that it followed the guidelines of the old Kansas City sparkler. It was short, to the point, and had a message. It was send money, but it justified where the money came from. It told you what they were going to do with the money. And that type of sparkler information will raise funds, and I'm sure it did.
Do you have any additional thoughts on the problems of communications then, as far as engineers go? They many times have a tendency to be dull, and of course a lot of times the subjects that they cover are dull. How do you brighten
attention of anybody, but more often to hold the attention of an engineer. If we're giving an engineer summary, we'll talk a few facts and figures with a tutorial example and a conclusion, and then ask a question and fill it in with music or sound effects. And in 3 minutes, you can sell an idea. An example would be when cooling towers were first used for heating buildings. A little town of Belleville, Kansas, had an outdoor cooling tower which was adjacent to the local power plant. The cooling tower helped cool the diesel engines that generated electricity. And next to it was this factory building that made toys. Turns out it was a company, a not-for-profit company that made toys for Christmas for the handicapped and others. And one idea that we did in our sparkler, we showed how this factory was taking the hot water off the cooling tower, which went to the local city power plant in this small little town out in the high plains of Kansas, and used it to heat that factory building. Now, how that was done turned out that we showed it in about a 3-minute episode in Kansas City, and we called it free hot water. Well, we showed how it was done. We showed a little technical end of it in there, and in about 3 minutes, any engineer would get the idea. Use the hot water from the cooling tower to heat a factory building. And of course, there are many other buildings around Kansas City that came up right after that with this same concept. We called it free hot water. It was a Kansas City sparkler. That's one example.
Okay. As you look over your your long career in this industry and everything, what do you think was what would you look upon as your greatest accomplishment of your career?
Well, it had to be what the company assignment was, to bring perimeter heating to the Midwest. And while I make light of the idea that it came natural to me, I really didn't know whether supplying warm air to a structure should be on the inside wall or on the outside wall, because I came from the refrigeration field. But it made sense to me to put heat where it's needed most, and put heat in a structure where you'd be cold if it wasn't there. And then I always remember that the hot water people and steam people put their radiators there. Why not air? Well, that had to be one of the good things. The toughest was to take the same perimeter heating and to make it work well on cooling. And it always worked pretty good on cooling, but it worked a lot better when we supplemented the winter air on the perimeter system and the summer air from the inside of the house. A mixture of the two would work quite well in a residence. In a commercial building, it really didn't make a lot of difference whether you had perimeter cooling supplementing inside wall supplies of cooling or not. My remarks really are residentially directed. I think that was the number one thing that I worked on. From a company standpoint, my self-satisfaction came from motivating dealers to open up a guide and data book and try some of those theoretical things in there on the local home front, and calculating the correct heat loss of a house was probably the second thing that I tried to get across to dealers, commercially and residential-wise. Calculate the heat loss. You use smaller equipment. You bring energy conservation right on the surface to the local area fast. And then, of course, heating and cooling, both. Everything in Kansas City was heating and cooling, particularly the last 10, 15 years. And calculations were a part of it. We did this with the slide rule and with the calculator, and the last 5 years it's all been with computers. And I happen to be with the company that pioneered bringing the computer to the engineer's bench to the dealer, and we put a calculation program of these things onto the computer disk. And that was given cost-free to the industry and to the field for the first several years that we used it. If you bought in this case, a computer, we would give you the programs for it. I understand that still being being sold by ASHRAE, but it's sophisticated